A cold, successful businessman who believes in nothing but logic loses everything after an accident leaves him paralyzed. In desperation, he meets a mysterious street boy who claims he can help him walk again. Richard Hayes sipped his coffee without ever tasting it. He didn't drink it for pleasure. It was a routine. 2 precise shots of espresso, 1 cube of sugar, no cream. Always the same ceramic cup. Always at 8:02 a.m., not 8 a.m., not 8:05 a.m. His assistant, Monica, knew better than to get that wrong. Through the glass walls of his office, 31 stories above the city, he watched the market tick upward, stock symbols flickering like heartbeats on life support. It wasn't the view that mattered. It was the movement, the noise of gain and loss, the constant shifting current he had mastered like a conductor with his orchestra. Everything outside these walls moved. Inside, Richard held still. "Your meeting with the Shanghai investors has been confirmed for 9:15, Monica said, appearing at his door with a folder in hand. Richard didn't look at her. He nodded once, his eyes scanning the reports spread before him in perfectly aligned columns. Profit margins, cost projections, asset movements, control. "Have the call notes on my desk 5 minutes before," he said. "I already—" 5 minutes before," he repeated flatly. Monica hesitated, then nodded. Of course. The door clicked shut behind her. He didn't hear it. Or if he did, he didn't care. He thrived in order. Silence wasn't emptiness to him. It was precision. It was space without interference. His phone buzzed once. He didn't answer. Richard didn't believe in distractions. They were for people who didn't understand focus. He'd built his empire on unbroken attention, on analysis without emotion. While others flinched, hesitated, he made the hard calls, sold early, cut losses, absorbed risk like armor. He didn't need luck. He needed data. The world, as he saw it, was a puzzle with pieces that could always be arranged. By 8:53 a.m., he had signed off on 3 merger decisions and rejected 2 more. By 9:12, he was adjusting his tie in the window's reflection, smoothing the knot down with measured fingers. There was no hesitation, no checking his hair, no last-minute second-guessing, just symmetry. But none of that mattered by 9:44 p.m. That night, the sky bled grey as rain beat down on the windshield of his Mercedes. The leather interior glowed under the soft dash lights, quiet and controlled. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other adjusting the volume of the news broadcast. A merger collapsed in Europe. Oil dipped. He listened, calculating the chain reaction before the analysts could. The intersection was empty. The light was green. The other car came from nowhere. Headlights exploded into his vision. Too close, too fast. A scream of metal against metal. Tires shrieked, glass shattered like gunfire. The Mercedes spun once, then again, as if the universe had yanked it by the spine. Richard didn't scream. There was no time. His body slammed forward, the wheel crushed into his chest. A crack echoed through his spine. The world tilted sideways, weightless, soundless, before collapsing into black. For a moment, nothing existed. Not numbers, not control, not even pain. Just the strange, heavy silence of being thrown out of everything you've ever known. When his eyes flickered open, he didn't know how much time had passed. The world was white, unnaturally bright. The ceiling above him was plain and pale. The room smelled of alcohol and rubber and cold plastic. Richard surfaced through a thick, buzzing quiet, like trying to wake underwater. Brightness burned behind his eyelids, relentless and sterile. Somewhere nearby, a machine beeped steadily, a sound too clean to be comforting. Richard Hayes blinked. The ceiling above him was white, smooth, featureless. The kind of ceiling you only saw in hospitals or prison cells. His throat was dry. He turned his head to the side, and something sharp pinched at his neck. And fourth monitors, tubes, wires. Where the hell? A weight dropped in his chest, a dense, unfamiliar heaviness that grew sharper the more he noticed. He couldn't feel the blanket on his legs, couldn't feel the tightness of the sheets or the air on his skin, couldn't even tell if he was cold. He tried to sit up, his arms strained weakly against the mattress, barely lifting his torso. His left shoulder gave out, and his body slipped sideways. His temple clipped the steel guardrail with a hollow thunk. A small flash of pain lit up in his skull. But nothing followed through his lower body. "Mr. Hayes," a voice, calm and rehearsed, filtered into the room. "Please don't move just yet." A doctor stepped into his line of sight, mid-40s maybe, with a face trained not to flinch. "You're in recovery," the man said. "There was an accident. Your car was hit on the driver's side, multiple rollovers." Richard stared at him. Not a word came out. "We stabilized you," the doctor continued, clipboard in hand. "There were internal injuries, but you're past the danger. You're safe." Richard forced his mouth to move. "My legs," he rasped. "I can't feel—" The doctor's eyes flicked down, just once, and that was the moment Richard knew. Before the words were spoken, before the term irreversible even entered the room, he saw it written in the way the man's jaw tensed, the measured inhale, the way he paused like he'd done this too many times before. "There was severe trauma to your spinal cord," the doctor said gently. "The damage, it was extensive. We did everything we could, but the nerves at the lumbar region were completely severed." Silence. The beeping from the monitor filled the room like a ticking clock. "You mean temporary?" Richard said, slowly, like correcting a math error. "You mean I'll need rehab? You mean I'll walk again? I mean the injury is permanent." That word. Permanent. Richard's breath stopped short. He blinked hard. "No," he said, almost laughing. "No, you don't get to say that. There are treatments, clinical trials. I have access. I can bring in people from—" "We've already consulted the best," the doctor interrupted, still calm. "The scans are conclusive. There's no surgical path forward." Richard clenched his fists. "I can pay for it. I'm not talking about money." "No," Richard snapped. "You're talking about limits. I don't believe in limits. I've built an empire on solving impossible problems." "This isn't about willpower, Mr. Hayes." Richard's voice dropped. "Everything is about willpower." The doctor nodded slightly, then set the clipboard down on the side table. "I'll give you some time." He left quietly. The door clicked shut. For a long time Richard lay there, surrounded by machines and wires, silence pressing against his eardrums. His eyes darted across the room, white walls, polished tile, a faint antiseptic tang that clung to everything. And there, across from the bed, parked like a challenge, was the wheelchair. It looked clean, almost elegant, but to Richard, it might as well have been a coffin on wheels. His breath came faster now. He ripped the blanket off, half expecting the motion to jolt something back to life. His legs lay there, still, foreign, not numb, not tingling, just absent. His hand curled into a fist. Slowly, deliberately, he brought it down on his thigh. Once, twice, then harder. The sound was sickening, flesh against flesh. He struck again, teeth gritted until red marks bloomed across the skin. Nothing. No pain, no reflex, no resistance. He panted, chest rising and falling, a hollow kind of rage crackling behind his eyes. "This isn't real," he muttered. "This isn't real." He reached for the call button, called for Monica, told her to set up a meeting with his medical contacts, told her to find out who was running spinal regeneration trials in Zurich, in Boston, in Seoul. Told her to book them, all of them. Price irrelevant. she answered quietly. He didn't notice the tremor in her voice. Within the hour, the specialists responded. 2 were unavailable, 1 declined. The last one sent over an assistant to explain, in careful, clinical terms, why no known treatment would change the prognosis. Science had boundaries, and Richard, who had spent a lifetime pushing past them, finally slammed into one that didn't budge. By nightfall, he was alone again. The nurse had adjusted his pillows. The chart had been updated. His vitals were stable. None of it mattered. He stared at the wheelchair. It didn't blink, didn't move, just sat there, quietly reminding him of what was gone. No screaming, no slamming fists against walls. Just stillness. His eyes didn't leave the chair. And for the first time since the accident, Richard Hayes said nothing at all. The healing went better than expected. The doctors used words like remarkable and ahead of schedule, nodding at charts as if progress could be measured by ink and numbers alone. But Richard felt none of it. Each day, he moved more, but inside, he remained still. The wheelchair creaked faintly as he adjusted himself, fingers learning the cold geometry of the rims. It wasn't the pain that bothered him. It was the permanence. The silent admission that this chair, this frame of metal and rubber, might be part of him now. Not an aid, not a phase, a presence. And so began the ritual, learning the angles of narrow doorways, the resistance of carpet, the invisible hierarchy of eye level. The world had changed, or maybe it had stayed exactly the same, and he was just now seeing it from the outside. One morning, like every other day, Richard went for a walk by himself in the park near his house. The wheels clicked softly beneath him, each rotation a muted reminder of what he no longer controlled. The sidewalk was uneven in places, forcing his hands to tighten around the rims. Palms already beginning to blister from the friction. It wasn't even 9 a.m., but the city was already pulsing. Alive, in a way he no longer was. Richard Hayes moved through the streets like a ghost in daylight. No assistant, no driver, no discreet security detail. Just him, the chair, and a silence that somehow grew louder with every corner he turned. He insisted on pushing himself, not out of pride, not anymore, but because he needed to feel something that he could still command. He stopped at the edge of a bustling plaza, the kind of public space developers added to make concrete feel human. Children darted through fountains. A vendor was already calling out the day's deals on bagels and coffee, shouting over the screech of bus brakes and distant sirens. The world hadn't stopped. Not for him. Not at all. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, broke away from her mother's hand and wandered toward him. Her gaze locked onto Richard's chair with quiet, solemn curiosity. No pity. Just a question she hadn't learned how to ask yet. Richard met her eyes. For a second, neither moved. Then her mother, anxious, flustered, hurried over, whispering a tight apology before guiding the girl away. The child looked back once more, before disappearing into the crowd. Richard exhaled slowly. No one else noticed him. People passed by in waves, shoulders brushing, conversations overlapping, footsteps blurring into the hum of routine. He could have shouted, and they wouldn't have heard him. He was in the background now. Furniture, debris on the sidewalk. He shifted slightly in the chair. His hand drifted to his side pocket, habitually reaching for something that wasn't there. His car keys, a reflex built over decades. Gone. He let his hand fall. A jogger thundered past, a man in his early 30s, sweat glistening on tanned skin, earphones tucked in. The pavement vibrated beneath his steady stride. Strong legs, confident rhythm, not even out of breath. Richard turned his head to follow him, almost involuntarily. His fingers curled around the armrest, knuckles whitening. He wasn't even aware of the pressure until the edge bit into his palm. There was nothing remarkable about that runner, except that he could run, He sat in silence for a long time, eyes drifting from passing faces to moving bodies. Legs everywhere. Legs walking. Legs crossing. Legs tapping impatiently at street corners. Legs running, strolling, dancing, pacing. And his. Still. He looked down at them, not with shock anymore, but with something colder. A quiet resentment that wrapped around his spine like frost. He stared long enough to forget where he was, until the background faded into silence, like the city had turned to film, grainy and silent behind glass. "Need a hand crossing, buddy?" The voice snapped him out of the haze. A man, maybe 50, stood nearby with a polite half-smile, well-dressed, harmless. Richard didn't answer. The man nodded, a little awkward, and stepped back. "Okay, just thought I'd ask." Richard's eyes tracked him as he walked away, not because of the offer, but because of the way the man walked, easy, balanced, like he didn't think about it. Of course he didn't. They never did. Later, he found a quiet bench near the edge of the plaza and rolled himself beside it. He didn't sit on the bench. He wasn't that delusional. He just wanted to be still somewhere that didn't smell like antiseptic or bleach. A breeze swept through the trees, lifting napkins and wrappers and discarded receipts into the air like confetti no one celebrated. Something soft slapped against his wheel. He looked down. A newspaper page had caught on the rim. He pulled it off. The headline stared back at him. Bluestone Tech IPO exceeds expectations. Shares. Surge 47% on first day. Richard blinked once. He knew that name. It was a company he'd nearly acquired months ago. He'd passed. Too volatile, too untested. Now, they were flying without him. He folded the paper once, then again, and let it drop into the nearest bin. They didn't need him. The city didn't need him. Life didn't slow down when you stopped walking. It just forgot you were there. Somewhere, a boy laughed so loudly it startled the pigeons. A woman shouted into a phone about being late. A siren cut through the air. The sound of it all swirled around Richard like smoke, like a world too fast and too loud for someone who no longer moved with it. And yet, he stayed there, still, silent, watching the world that had moved on without him. The first time Richard saw the boy, he wasn't sure he was real. He had been sitting near the same cracked bench at the plaza's edge, in the same quiet shadow he now returned to, like a bad habit. The sky was a washed-out blue, sunlight bleeding through a gauze of smog. Around him, the city moved with its usual indifference. It didn't care that he showed up every morning, that he watched people live their lives, while his had narrowed to two silent wheels, and the ache of being forgotten. The boy was just there one moment, standing a few feet away, half in shadow, half in light, staring directly at him. Richard blinked, took him in, wiry frame, maybe 13. Shirt 2 sizes too big, sleeves rolled unevenly. Jeans torn, not in the fashionable way. Scuffed sneakers held together by the will of their laces. But it wasn't the clothes that held Richard's attention. It was the boy's eyes, sharp, deliberate, far too knowing for someone that young. Eyes like he'd already lived a life and was watching Richard like a story he'd read before. "Need something?" Richard asked, voice dry, defensive. The boy didn't move. "I can make you walk again." The words landed without warning. No context, no setup, just clean, calm confidence, as if he were offering directions to a train station. Richard blinked again, then snorted. "Is that so?" The boy nodded once. No grin, no hesitation, just stood there, arms loose at his sides like he had all the time in the world. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, skeptical. "What is this? Some kind of pitch? You got a product to sell? A treatment? Magic beans, maybe?" "I'm not selling anything." "You're not asking for money?" Richard raised an eyebrow. That's a first. I don't need anything from you, the boy said simply, but you need something you won't admit. Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. And what would that be? To believe that something outside your control might still matter. Richard's face shifted just enough to betray the hit. He turned his eyes away, toward the crowd beyond, as if the boy's presence might fade into the noise like everything else. But it didn't. He looked back. The boy was still there. You think I'm broken, Richard said. You think saying something cryptic and clever is going to wake me up, like I'm in some fairy tale coma. Let me save you the time. This isn't a story where a kid shows up and saves the bitter old man. I don't think you're broken, the boy replied. Richard's voice tightened. Don't patronize me. I think you're scared, the boy said, gently now, but not soft. And I think that terrifies you more than the chair ever did. Richard shifted in place. How old are you? Old enough. To do what? Whisper riddles at strangers in wheelchairs. To see the things no one else wants to see. The air stilled between them. You have a name? Richard asked, finally. Caleb. Richard considered that. You're not the first person to offer me hope, Caleb. They came in white coats with research papers and clinical trials. You know what they gave me? Caleb said nothing. False promises, Richard spat, and invoices. I'm not promising anything, Caleb said. I'm offering a choice. Richard scoffed. Between what? Sanity and delusion? Between standing still and moving forward? And you're the one to help me move forward, huh? Richard smiled tightly. Tell me, Caleb, how do you plan on doing that? Divine intervention? Voodoo? You got a potion in that ratty backpack of yours? Caleb didn't flinch. If you walk away right now, you'll never know. Richard stared at him. Then, slowly, deliberately, he pushed his wheels forward. The boy didn't move. Richard stopped when he realized Caleb's hand was gently resting on the side of his chair. Not forceful, just there, firm, quiet, like a hand on a wound that hadn't fully bled yet. Richard looked at the hand, then up at Caleb. If you don't let go of my chair, he said, voice low, I swear to God, I know you miss believing, Caleb interrupted. Richard froze. Caleb's eyes didn't blink. You think you hate miracles, but what you really hate, what eats at you, is that you no longer have control. You can't command your body, you can't out-strategize your spine, and you hate that more than anything. Richard's jaw clenched. Get your hand off my chair. Caleb did, but he didn't move away. I'll be around, he said. You think I'm just going to follow you? I think, Caleb said, finally turning, you'll follow the part of you that wants to prove me wrong. Richard watched him walk off. No urgency, no backward glance, just vanishing into the hum of the city like a ghost who had unfinished business. But something stirred in Richard Hayes. Not belief, not hope, not yet, but curiosity. And it terrified him more than the silence ever had. Richard found Caleb again 2 days later, almost exactly where he'd left him. Same cracked sidewalk near the plaza's edge. Same posture, arms loose, one foot crossed over the other, as if the world weren't spinning too fast for boys like him to keep up. Caleb looked up when Richard approached, but didn't smile, didn't speak first. He just watched. I don't know why I came back, Richard muttered, wheeling himself to a stop. But let's not pretend this is fate. Caleb nodded once, like he agreed. I've got 15 minutes, Richard added. That's all I'm wasting. I won't need that much. Richard sighed. Caleb walked to the nearby bench and sat, resting his elbows on his knees. The plaza buzzed with morning energy, horns in the distance, the mechanical rumble of a bus, people laughing too loud into phones. But between them, There was a strange hush, like the noise had bent around their conversation before it began. "I was 7, Caleb said. "It happened in spring. I remember because I was wearing a Spider-Man t-shirt and the sleeves were too short. I tripped running after a soccer ball in the street. I didn't see the car coming." Richard's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. "I don't remember the impact," Caleb continued. "Just the sound. Metal on bone, my mum screaming, and then dark, like someone pulled the world's plug." He paused, then leaned down and quietly rolled up the right leg of his jeans. A thin scar, pale and crooked, traced down the front of his thigh. "I didn't feel anything from here down for almost a year," he said, letting the fabric fall again. "Doctors said it was permanent. Damage too deep. No signals getting through." Richard glanced at the scar, then quickly away. They tried everything. Therapy, electrical stimulation, even a clinic out in Texas. Nothing worked. My mum, she couldn't accept it. She wouldn't. She found this man, someone people whispered about, never advertised. A healer, they called him. Lived 2 towns over, no credentials, no equipment. Just a room that smelled like old wood and something burning. Richard snorted. "Sounds very FDA approved." Caleb ignored the sarcasm. "He didn't ask for money. Didn't say he could fix me. He only said one thing to my mum. He'll walk if he decides to." "That's vague enough to apply to a tree stump," Richard said. Caleb smiled faintly. "She made me go back, every week. I hated it at first. He didn't do much, just talked. Asked me questions no one had asked before. About fear, about control, about whether I believed I deserved to be whole." Richard's brow twitched, but he said nothing. One day it changed. Not all at once. Just a sensation, a shift inside. Like silence breaking open from the inside. He let the image sit. Richard's fingers tapped lightly on his wheel rim, a subtle, involuntary motion. "Look," Richard finally said, "I've read enough case studies to know spontaneous nerve reconnections happen. Rare, but not impossible. Maybe that's what this was. Random timing, coincidence." "Maybe," Caleb said. "And this man, this healer, you're saying he just helped you believe?" "No," Caleb said, looking directly at him. "I'm saying he didn't give me anything I didn't already have." Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. Caleb's tone softened. "I'm not asking you to believe in magic, Richard. I'm asking if you remember what it feels like to believe in anything at all." Richard's jaw tightened. "Don't—" "When was the last time?" Caleb asked quietly. "When was the last time you believed in something you couldn't prove?" The question hung in the air like a stone suspended mid-fall. Richard stared at him. He didn't answer. He couldn't. A silence grew between them, not empty, but full, heavy, charged. Caleb leaned forward. "Let's make a deal." Richard narrowed his eyes. "What kind of deal?" "If I'm right, if this healer can do what I say, then you help us. You make a donation to the people who need it most. Not charity, not pity, just balance. And if you're wrong?" "I disappear," Caleb said. "You'll never see me again." Richard let out a dry laugh. "That's a dramatic exit." "It's not a trick," Caleb replied. "It's a choice." Richard didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward the plaza, the blur of people walking past, people with errands and appointments and destinations that required movement, people whose legs answered when they called. He looked down at his own, still, silent. He thought about that question again. When was the last time you believed in something you couldn't prove? He couldn't remember, and that terrified him more than the wheelchair ever had. He looked back at Caleb, and for the first time in a long while, Richard Hayes didn't speak with cynicism or strategy or calculation. He just nodded. "One chance," he said. Caleb stood, hands in his pockets. "I only need one." And then Caleb led Richard to a place on the edge of the city, where concrete frayed into dirt, where GPS signals flickered and street names gave way to memory. Caleb led, silent as always, weaving through side roads and unmarked turns like someone moving by instinct, not direction. Richard followed in the back seat of a rusted station wagon, its springs groaning beneath the weight of silence and uncertainty. The city's noise faded quickly, swallowed by trees that grew wild and unapologetic. No cell towers, no power lines, just the kind of green that felt untouched, or maybe forgotten. After nearly an hour, the road disappeared altogether. "We walk from here," Caleb said, already stepping out. Richard stared at him through the window. "Funny." Caleb rounded the car, opened the door, and unfolded Richard's wheelchair. He didn't joke. Didn't comment on the irony. He simply helped Richard transfer, then began pushing him down a narrow path, carved through tall grass and old forest. It smelled like damp wood and crushed leaves. Somewhere, birds called low and hollow. The wheels bumped against roots and uneven ground. Richard gritted his teeth, but didn't complain. Pride still lingered, chipped and fragile, but there. After 20 minutes, the trees gave way. What emerged was not what he expected. A cluster of homes, small, hand-built, some with mismatched shingles and patched walls, but clean, cared for. A garden of herbs and wildflowers lined the path, and wind chimes whispered in the breeze. The air here felt different, thicker somehow, like it remembered more than it should. People moved slowly through the clearing. No rush, no phones, no urgent errands, just presence. A boy with a bandage over one eye laughed with an old man who limped but carried a basket full of apples. A woman with white hair and dark skin sat under a fig tree, humming something low and rhythmic as she braided her granddaughter's hair. They didn't look surprised to see Caleb, or Richard. A few nodded in greeting. One woman waved. "This is it?" Richard asked. Caleb didn't answer. They rolled deeper in, toward a circular building made of stone and wood. Lanterns lined the entry, flickering even in daylight. Not electric, actual fire. Inside, the air shifted again. Not colder, but heavier. Like a library, or a memory. And there he was. Samuel. He stood at the center of the room beside a low burning fire pit. Older than Richard had expected. 60, maybe 70. Crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled, barefoot. Not a trace of theatricality, just calm. Like a lake that had never known wind. "You must be Richard," Samuel said. His voice was low and even, like it had been filtered through time. "I'm not staying long," Richard replied. Samuel smiled faintly. "You've already stayed longer than most skeptics." Richard looked around. No machines, no beds, no charts. "I assume you're not licensed. I assume you're not here because you believe in licenses." That landed harder than it should have. Richard said nothing. Samuel motioned for Caleb to step back. The boy did, taking a seat on the floor near the wall, legs crossed. "You came," Samuel said, stepping closer. "That matters more than you think." "I came for a bet," Richard replied. "Not faith." Samuel nodded, accepting that. "Do you know what most people want when they arrive here? To be healed?" "No," Samuel said. "To be certain." Richard blinked. "But certainty is just the cage we build around fear. It keeps us from risking belief." "You speak like a philosopher," Richard muttered. "But I don't see a cure." "Do you think healing is a cure?" Samuel asked gently. "Or is it the part of you that finally remembers how to be whole?" Richard looked down at his hands. "Let's not do riddles. My spine was crushed. I don't need metaphors. I need nerves." Samuel stepped closer, then sat beside him. Not above, not behind, but level. "There are those who walked in here with nothing left," Samuel said. "No vision, no heartbeat, no breath, and they left different. Recovered? Transformed? Through what exactly?" Samuel gestured toward the room. Through silence, through patience, through remembering who they were before the world told them they were broken. Richard almost laughed. "You're saying the problem is forgetting? I'm saying the body follows what the soul allows." The fire crackled between them. A young man entered quietly, carrying a tray of tea. He had a cane strapped to his back, unused. His steps were firm. "Was he one of yours?" Richard asked, nodding toward the man. Samuel didn't answer. He didn't need to. Richard stared at the flame. "You're not promising anything?" "No," Samuel said. "I don't promise. I invite, and if I say this is nonsense—" "You're free to leave," Samuel said, standing slowly. "But some part of you came here not to disprove this. You came because something inside you remembered what hope used to feel like." Silence stretched again. Finally, Richard looked up. "What happens now?" "You stay," Samuel said. "You listen. You don't ask what's next. No tests, no interventions, no scripts." Richard shifted in his chair. "Just wait to be enlightened." Samuel smiled. "Just be still long enough for yourself to arrive?" Caleb stood, his eyes on Richard. Not proud, not smug, just watchful, waiting. And for the first time, Richard didn't resist the waiting. He didn't believe. Not yet. But something inside him had stopped resisting, and that somehow was already different. The ceremony was set for dusk. By then, the clearing had turned quiet, the kind of quiet that felt intentional, like even the trees were holding their breath. Shadows stretched long across the grass, and the air held a weight it hadn't carried earlier. Not ominous, not heavy, just expectant. Richard sat in his wheelchair, hands resting on the rims, watching as a group of people moved silently into the stone structure. No one spoke. No one directed. They simply knew where to go, like the rhythm of this place was etched into their bones. Samuel appeared in the doorway. "We're ready when you are," he said. Richard hesitated, then nodded. Inside, the space had changed. The central fire had been stoked into a steady flame. Around it, dozens of small candles flickered, placed in no discernible order, but somehow forming a shape. A spiral, maybe, or something older, more instinctual. The walls smelled of burnt sage and cedar. The air was thick with it, not suffocating, but enough to dull the sharp edges of thought. 6 others were seated already, each on low wooden stools arranged in a wide circle. No one looked at Richard, not out of rudeness. They just weren't focused on him. They were somewhere else already. Eyes half-lidded, breath slow, hands open on their knees. Samuel gestured toward an empty stool. "Here," he said. "We begin from the ground." Richard looked at the stool. It was barely a foot off the floor. No back, no arms. Primitive. It might as well have been a rock. "I assume you're not expecting me to—" "I'll help," Caleb said, suddenly behind him. Richard flinched slightly. He hadn't heard him come in. "No need," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But he allowed Caleb to assist. With effort and caution, Richard shifted from the wheelchair onto the stool. His legs dragged uselessly beneath him, a dead weight he tried not to acknowledge. The moment his body settled, the cold of the stone floor seeped up through the seat. It wasn't pain, it was perspective. He felt small, not just physically, but existentially, like something towering and invisible had taken its place above him. Samuel moved to the center of the circle. A young woman, no older than 20, lit a thick coil of incense and placed it near the fire. Smoke rose slowly, curling into patterns Richard couldn't name. Then the chanting began, low melodic syllables from a tongue he didn't recognize. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't sweet. It just was. Richard closed his eyes. He didn't mean to. They just shut. And then something strange happened. He heard the words, but not as they were. Somewhere beneath the foreign language, English syllables rose, not spoken, but felt. Release, surrender, open. It made no sense, but it made sense. His arms prickled, not goosebumps, something deeper. A hum, low and subtle, like static before a storm. The warmth started at the base of his spine and trickled outward, not fast, not dramatic, just present. He didn't move, couldn't, even if he'd wanted to, and then gone, like a tide that reached the shore and receded just before it touched sand. The warmth vanished. The hum went still. The words faded. Silence returned. Too fast. Too clean. Richard opened his eyes. Samuel stood in front of him, one hand hovering inches from Richard's chest, palm open, but not touching. His face was calm, not apologetic, not triumphant, just still. "That's it?" Richard asked. Samuel's hand dropped. "That's today." Richard blinked. No. I came all the way out here for... What, a séance? A séance that ends in nothing? "No ending," Samuel said. "Only beginning." "You think this is enough?" Richard's voice rose. A whisper of warmth and a few candle tricks. A few of the others turned toward him. Caleb stood now, a few feet behind. "I sat in that chair," Richard snapped, "and I opened myself to this circus, and you, what? You felt something and called it healing." "No one called it healing," Samuel said, voice quiet. "I did not come here for metaphors. I came for something real." Samuel nodded slowly. "Then you're closer than you think." Richard's hands shook, not from fear, from rage. "You know what this feels like to someone like me. This feels like mockery." I lowered myself, humiliated myself, sat there like a child waiting for magic. "And now what? You pat me on the head and tell me I'm getting warmer." He shoved backward, reaching for his wheelchair. Caleb moved to help, but Richard spun sharply, nearly toppling. "Don't!" Richard barked. "Don't touch me!" Caleb stepped back, hands raised. Richard yanked the wheels forward with sudden force. The rubber skid against the smooth stone floor, leaving a thick black arc. A messy, ugly smear across the space that had moments ago felt sacred. It stayed behind him as he rushed toward the door. He didn't look back, didn't see Samuel watching him, didn't see the rest of the circle remain seated, unmoved, unstartled. Didn't see Caleb lower his gaze, not in shame, but in something else. Outside, the night had fallen. The sky was deep blue, stars scattered like quiet witnesses. The path was dark, uneven, but Richard didn't stop. He pushed harder than he needed to, muscles straining, jaw locked tight. When he reached the edge of the clearing, he paused, only for a second. He looked at the dirt, the trees, the quiet. He wanted to curse, wanted to laugh. Instead, he just whispered, "Of course," and disappeared into the dark. The elevator opened with a chime far too cheerful for the hour. Richard wheeled himself down the quiet hallway of his building, his apartment door clicking shut behind him with a sound sharper than usual. The lights inside were dim. He didn't turn them on. Instead, he made his way to the living room by memory, letting the city's muted glow leak through the floor-to-ceiling windows like a half-hearted apology. He tossed his keys onto the marble counter, an old habit still intact, and reached for the remote. The television blinked to life, flooding the silence with the calm, practiced voice of a late-night anchor reading headlines about inflation and election drama. The volume was low, barely above a murmur, but it was enough. Enough to keep the stillness from closing in. He didn't watch. The images flickered across the screen without landing. His eyes stayed fixed on the far window, where the reflection of the apartment floated faintly against the glass. A ghost of a man in a wheelchair, silent, expressionless. He should have felt nothing. That's what he told himself. He had expected the ceremony to be useless, expected the chants, the candles, the ancient ritual to dissolve into the absurdity it always was. And yet, something had stirred, just for a second. A warmth, a buzz. A shift too subtle to dismiss, but too fleeting to grasp. He'd spent the whole ride back convincing himself it was nothing. A trick of atmosphere. A psychological echo from being surrounded by believers. But now, in this quiet space, far removed from the smoke and firelight, the doubt clung to him like humidity. He turned off the TV. Darkness fell thick. Richard sat still for a long time, his breath slow, controlled. Then, finally, he wheeled himself into the bedroom. Everything here was pristine, crisp lines, stark design, no clutter, no softness, a museum of life built on order. He transferred himself to the bed with practiced efficiency, adjusted the pillows behind his back, and stared at the ceiling. The hum of the city seeped in faintly from outside, the distant pulse of traffic, a siren wailing somewhere far off, the soft groan of old pipes in the walls. Familiar noises, steady ones, and then it came. A whisper of sensation, so faint it might have been imagined, a pressure, a warmth, a presence, right at the tip of his left big toe. Richard's eyes opened, his breath caught. He stayed completely still, trying to isolate the feeling. It wasn't painful, not a tingling either. More like awareness, like that part of his body had returned to the room without asking permission. His hands began to shake. He blinked hard, then threw the blanket off, baring his legs to the cold air. They looked the same. Still. Colorless. Lifeless. He stared at his feet and waited. Nothing. Then, like a cruel echo, the sensation came again. Subtle. Definite. Richard reached out, opened the drawer beside the bed, and pulled out a small flashlight. He clicked it on and shined the narrow beam directly at his toes. The skin reflected the light dully, unmoving. He touched his foot. No reaction. He tapped the top of it. Nothing. Hit it lightly. Still nothing. But he felt something. Not touch, not pain, but a presence. Something real. Something that wasn't there before. His heart pounded faster. He leaned back slowly, the flashlight dropping to his lap, casting an angled glow across the bed and part of the wall. And there it was. The shadow of his wheelchair, stretched grotesquely by the light, warped by angle and movement. The wheels cast jagged loops. The seat formed a hollow mouth. It looked wrong, like it didn't belong to him. Richard stared at it, and then he laughed. Once, hollow. He didn't know what scared him more, that he might be imagining all of this, or that he wasn't. Because if the feeling was real, if something truly had changed, then everything he'd built his identity around was crumbling. The science, the logic, the diagnoses, the years of cold, calculated acceptance. He had made peace with never walking again, had buried the part of himself that once raged against it. That version of him, the one who begged doctors and funded research and demanded answers, had died quietly in a rehab center 3 months into paralysis. Now, that ghost was clawing its way back, and Richard wasn't sure he wanted it, because what came with hope was vulnerability, and Richard Hayes had built his empire on invincibility. He reached for his tablet on the nightstand, opened the photo gallery, and pulled up the last MRI image. The cross-section of his spine glowed coldly on the screen. Black and white and unarguable. The fracture was there, permanent, inoperable, irreversible. He stared at it like a contract, but now for the first time he wondered if contracts could lie. He set the tablet down. Outside, a breeze pushed gently against the windows. The curtains stirred. Faint city light passed across the foot of the bed, catching the skin of his legs in soft silver. He didn't sleep. Instead, he lay there, eyes wide, toe still buzzing faintly, like a memory trying to speak. And somewhere between the fear and the flicker of belief, Richard Hayes began to understand something terrifying. Hope wasn't a gift. It was a dare. The sun rose without drama. No glorious explosion of light, no poetic burn through clouds, just a slow, steady brightening of the sky that Richard barely noticed. He hadn't slept. The room, even in daylight, felt heavy with what had passed between midnight and dawn. His toe still buzzed faintly, like a forgotten alarm sounding from deep within the architecture of his body. He didn't shower, didn't eat, didn't speak. He simply got dressed in silence, pulled on a dark sweater, loose slacks, and wheeled himself out the door before his brain had time to catch up. There was no message to Caleb, no prior call to the community. He just went. The same path, the same rusted station wagon was left unlocked where it always sat, as if they'd been expecting him. He drove without music this time, no distractions, just the crunch of gravel under the tires, the ache in his palms when he gripped the wheel too tightly, and the quiet thump of his heartbeat. Louder now, more present. He noticed it. The forest greeted him not with mystery this time, but with memory. The scent of pine and damp soil were no longer foreign. The way the trees bowed in slightly, as though aware of him now, like something had shifted and they had taken notice. He pushed himself along the same narrow path, his movements steadier, almost rhythmic, the wheelchair bumping along with less resistance. And when he arrived at the stone building, Samuel was already there, waiting. No words were exchanged. Samuel only nodded, then stepped aside to let him in. The room looked the same. Candles, the low-burning fire, the circle of stools. But the energy had changed. Or maybe Richard had. The air was thicker, warmer, expectant. Only a few others were gathered this time. Familiar faces, now etched with something deeper. Not sympathy, not even anticipation, just presence. Samuel walked forward, stopping beside Richard. He didn't ask if he was ready, didn't ask why he had come back. He simply placed a hand on Richard's chest, right above his heart, and closed his eyes. Richard froze. No philosophy, no ritual, just that one touch. And with it, his breath quickened. Not from fear, not from pain, but from recognition. His body remembered something before his mind could name it. A stirring, a pressure, not external, but from within. Like something caged was pacing just beneath his ribs, claws scratching bone. He was helped again onto the low wooden stool. Low, no complaints this time. He welcomed the cold seat, welcomed the vulnerability, because something in him was done resisting. The chanting began again, deeper than before, a low vibration that crawled through the floorboards and up through his spine like a language older than anything spoken. Smoke curled around his ankles, sweet and biting. Someone placed a bowl of burning leaves beside the fire. It hissed, cracked. The scent wasn't calming, it was piercing, raw. And then it happened. Not a miracle, not a moment of cinematic glory, just a flicker, a tremble in his foot, so small he almost didn't register it. But it was real, not imagined, not projected, not wished, real. His big toe moved, his eyes widened. His breath caught. Another flicker, this time higher. His ankle shifted, then a pulse of heat surged through his lower back. Not warmth, fire. It burned through his spine, crashing into the years of numbness, like a river cracking ice. He cried out, not from pain, but from shock. His arms gripped the edges of the stool as his legs spasmed gently, twitching against the floor like newborn limbs, remembering their purpose. Samuel stepped back, his face unreadable. The chanting grew louder, only slightly, but enough to feel like it was rising with him. And then, Richard stood. It wasn't graceful. His knees buckled. His weight shifted violently. His balance was wrong, but his feet held, ankles trembling, thighs straining, chest heaving. He stood. A silence spread through the room, swift and deep. Then, a single gasp. Then another. Then the air fractured with movement. People rising to their feet, hands to mouths, tears streaming silently. But Richard heard none of it. He was somewhere else. Somewhere in the summer, age 7. A bike crash, a bleeding knee, and his mother kneeling in front of him, eyes kind but firm. "Just stand up, sweetheart. If you can stand, everything will be all right." He had believed her then, and now, with sweat pouring down his face, he believed her again. A step, wobbly and weak. Another. Hands reached for him. He waved them off. He wanted the moment. He earned it. By the time he reached Caleb, the boy's eyes were full, but he didn't speak, didn't reach. He simply let Richard fall into him, not collapse, not stumble. Richard wept, not for the legs that moved, but for the part of himself that had refused to move for so long, for the mind that had stopped believing, for the soul that had gone quiet, and now screamed, "I am alive." He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. His body said it for him, and the whole room heard. After being able to walk, Richard didn't leave. Not after that day. Not after that step. He stayed in the community, not as a patient, not even as a guest, but as something in between. A man learning to exist again, one quiet moment at a time. The days no longer felt like battles to win, but soil to plant. And Richard, who once measured value by outcome, began to see meaning in things without proof. He spent his mornings walking slowly across the compound, each movement still cautious, but purposeful. His stride was uneven. His balance required thought, but his steps were real. One morning, he knelt, truly knelt, for the first time in years. There, beside the herb garden, his hands fumbling in the dirt, he tried to help an old woman remove stubborn weeds. Her left eye was milky with blindness, and she hummed tunelessly as she worked. "You're doing it wrong," she said after a few minutes, smiling without looking at him. Richard grunted. "That's possible. Dig deeper. Pull from the root, not the top. If not, it just grows back." He followed her instructions. His fingers were clumsy, but he obeyed. The soil was cool, the weeds stronger than he expected. "You think I was ever good at this?" she asked. "No," she chuckled. "I wasn't. But the dirt doesn't care who you used to be. It only asks if you're here now." Richard stared at the dark earth between his fingers. He nodded. That afternoon, someone handed him a bowl of soup and asked for nothing in return. Someone else handed him a story about their pain, their healing, their doubts. He listened, really listened, and in their voices he heard the music of survival. Not triumphant, but true. Each day bled into the next, and he found comfort in the blurring. Weeks later, he returned briefly to the city, to the house with the mirrored floors and glass walls. Everything inside gleamed, but nothing glowed. The silence wasn't peace. It was absence. He sat on the edge of the vast bed that used to cradle his exhaustion like a trophy, and all he could think was, "There's no life here." He sold it all, not out of bitterness, not as a grand gesture, simply because it no longer felt like his. The suits, the stocks, the symbols of power, they had served him once, but they didn't know who he was now. He redirected everything. The idea came one night by candlelight, his feet soaking in warm water as an old man taught him how to grind healing roots. A rehabilitation center, but not like the sterile halls he'd known. A place of wholeness, of slowness, of belief. They broke ground within months, right next to the community that had saved him. The Hayes Center for Restoration and Hope was built with rounded walls, warm colors, and wide-open courtyards where the wind could always reach. It had therapy rooms, a communal kitchen, gardens, and quiet spaces to simply be. People came not just for physical recovery, but for something deeper, permission to trust again. The day of the center's opening, the crowd gathered early. Residents, volunteers, former skeptics, and lost souls alike. Media trucks came too, drawn by the strangeness of the story. The wealthy man who walked again and gave everything away. A podium stood in the courtyard. Reporters leaned forward. Richard approached slowly, dressed in a plain shirt and worn boots, now walking without a cane, though still cautious. He didn't speak. Instead, he looked at Caleb and nodded. The boy, no longer just a boy, stepped forward, adjusting the mic. "Most of you don't know how this started," Caleb began. "But I do. It started with a man who hated being seen as weak, who trusted no one, who refused every hand that tried to help." A few chuckles stirred in the crowd. And then, Caleb smiled. "He met me." Laughter now, warmer. "I told him something ridiculous, that I could help him walk again, and you should have seen his face. He looked at me like I was the punchline to a very bad joke. But now, look." He turned toward Richard. "No one healed him. He chose healing. We just reminded him how." There was no applause yet, just a hush. Then Caleb said more quietly, "The real miracle wasn't when he stood up. It was when he stopped needing to prove anything. And with that, he stepped back." The audience rose, not in a frenzy, in reverence. Later, when the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed into the courtyards and gardens, Caleb found Richard sitting alone under a fig tree, the same one where he had first seen people laughing again. He sat beside him. "I should go," Caleb said after a while. "To where?" "Don't know. Keep walking, I guess." Richard didn't reply. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. It was old, creased along the edges. Caleb unfolded it slowly. It was a legal adoption form, signed. "You have a home now," Richard said softly. Caleb didn't speak. He only leaned forward, wrapped his arms around Richard for the first time, and wept into the man's shoulder. It was not a tearful goodbye. It was the beginning of a shared life. Weeks passed. Seasons shifted. And one morning, in the center's garden, Richard walked slowly down the path, nodding to patients, waving at volunteers. His steps were slow, but his back was straight. His hands, once used to sign mergers, now planted trees and held trembling fingers during therapy sessions. Caleb sat on a bench nearby, laughing at something an old gardener said. Inside the main office, a new photo had been framed and hung. It wasn't from the day Richard stood up. It wasn't from the press conference or the ribbon cutting. It was a quiet moment, a candid capture of Richard laughing with his mouth full of dirt, knees covered in soil, shirt stained with sweat. It had been taken when he fell trying to lift a garden bed and ended up laughing like a child. Beneath the photo was a small brass plaque. The miracle wasn't that he stood, it was that he knew he was alive.